This is short. It's brief. You go enjoy it, but it brings these themes right out to the front. If you've got the hero who starts off by just terrorizing his own people that he's supposed to be king over, shepherding and looking out for, and then because of that, the gods check him by creating like his counterpart, if you will. It's and in effect becomes this kind of Patroclus type figure who he befriends after they wrestle and fight, and they realize, hey, we're basically equals. And they become best friends, and then spoilers, Enkidu dies, and that moment is what launches him into despair. Like, wow, I've lost my best friend, and if he died and he's my equal, then I might die, and I don't want to die. And so he goes on the quest for immortality.
Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve, presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel, and click the bell icon to receive notifications so that you will remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. If you would like to support the work of BetterPears with your Federal Reserve notes and receive fractional gold in the mail, please follow the link in the description to our crowdfunding program, BetterPears Leaves. Now then, the structure of the show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Michael Kelleher, Dean of Curriculum at Northwest Ohio Classical Academy in Toledo, Ohio. He holds degrees in classics from Hillsdale College and the University of California, Santa Barbara. Together with his wife Marcy, Michael has authored 2 children's books on biblical figures and the lives of the saints. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest today on the Confederal Reserve, Michael Kelleher. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a very warm introduction. I appreciate that.
It's our pleasure to have you. So we'll get right off to our question. What is your vintage work, and why is it so important?
Yeah. As you know, when you first reach out about this was very hard for me to pick, and I think that's the challenge of being a classics wonk. There's a lot of vintage works that I love, but and yeah. So anyway, I've eventually settled on the Epic of Gilgamesh.
The Epic of Gilgamesh. Very good.
Yeah, and I think the short answer to why is it's because it's the first. And it was, when I first encountered it, I had already had a couple years of, I had finished my college degree in classics, so I knew the Latin, I knew the Greek, I was familiar with the tradition of the epics, etc., and the how Virgil is directly trying to play with the epic tradition, etc. But then to encounter a work of literature that precedes these by millennia, or at least a millennium, and still, I don't know, it just kind of taps into a spirit of things that was just so unique to me. And so the first time I ever experienced it was I was teaching at graduate school, and I've come back to it a couple different times. And it just kind of captured my imagination, both in how it at least explores the themes that you're going to find in the Greco-Roman world and that epic tradition, but also it lays the framework, kind of the background to the biblical tradition. And when Abraham, the story of Abraham begins with, there was a man in Ur, and then he's leaving that behind. Well, Ur is a real place, and there's a real civilization there, and there's there's a lot that's kind of lost if you don't know anything about Ur and Sumer and the Sumerian civilization, and a lot of that kind of, I feel like, at least poetically, comes out in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then also there's the finally there's the flood story, which is a whole nother kind of contact point, that this kind of story is in the background, but we it was very is not really familiar in terms of the Western tradition. You don't find Aquinas talking about it, or you don't find other philosophers who've picked it up. And really, thanks to the recent discovery in the last couple of hundred years of both the text and the ability to translate, it it elevates what we can know and say about the far distant past, which is, I don't know, that's kind of cool, just to be able to know more stuff.
Right, and just to clarify there, I mean, you mentioned St. Thomas, like he has commentaries about the flood, but just not the Epic
Right.
of Gilgamesh flood, right? So the flood
Correct.
of Genesis, yes, okay.
Right. Yeah, no,
Couple
that's,
of
yeah,
things.
I think what I mean is that, it's interesting to think of like the idea of traditions, both the Western tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition and the Christian tradition, and how these are like intersecting or commenting with each other, and then to realize, we can actually push back what we know about Western civilization by centuries, because of recent discoveries, and I use the term recent, you know, being on being 100 years as opposed to thousands of years, but still, um,
Right.
it reshapes the conversation about, well, what does Western civilization mean, and what the Western tradition mean. But at the
Well,
same time,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I would say like you've really thrown us into the deep end of the pool, right? Because
Right,
I think you mentioned even in
the
your kind
flood.
of experience, like the shallow end, not that it's incredibly shallow, but the less deep end would be like Homer's two epics that have survived, right?
Right.
The non-extant epics of Homer, perhaps, that we don't have, but in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's certain things that are just sort of like culturally. I don't necessarily think I don't understand myself as a seafaring person, but that kind of cultural kind of framing between the seafarers, the Achaeans, right, or the Greeks, and then
Mhm.
the people of the horse, the Trojans, and and perhaps there's something, I don't know, kind of European to Homer, that as you get farther east here to Babylon, to Ur, to in my mind, like Ur kind of becomes Babylon, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
geographically either the same place or under different management. Ur under different management, Babylon, right? um, and and that uh, one of the aspects is like that in this deep end, is it more Eastern than Western, right? I guess that would be one kind of concern in terms of how it fits into a Western canon. Is it part of the Western canon, or is it kind of like an Egyptian gold, kind of like good things that are resonating with sort of the human spirit or our human nature
Mhm.
that resonate in the West, uh, sort of in a sort of pre-Christian or pre-Judeo-Christian tradition that are kind of like, because of divine providence, that there would be similar kinds of things that survive historically in an Eastern epic versus a Western epic. So one question I'd like to discuss is sort of, is this an Eastern work or Western work?
Okay.
Uh, the other kind of vent or line of thought I want to kind of entertain with you is, what exactly is an epic, right?
Mhm.
Um, and how would you define it? And granted, right, is the definition is in a certain sense like a classification that we put on things,
Right.
but in terms of insofar as an epic generally holds a loftier kind of form than say the limerick, I don't know why, in terms of poetry.
Yeah, that needs to be changed.
Yeah, I know it's some really good limericks out there. What is it kind of essential to an epic? Is it just simply its form, or is there something else in terms of its content or its purpose, its focus? So let's make that kind of a second trajectory. But I want to kind of go on this east west thing for a moment, and your thoughts
Yeah,
on that.
that's a fair question. I think in my mind, well, I guess I'm going to try to have it both ways. So if you're Greek, if you're Greek, definitely it's Eastern. I mean, that's if you're Alexander the Great, you're saying, come on, Greeks, you remember those stinkers across the pond and what they did? Let's get back at them and let's invade. But in so doing, then let's Greekify them all. And you spread the wonders of Greek thought and everything from all the way as far to Kandahar, Afghanistan. Um, so, but so in that sense, yes. So like, and I guess from the Greek perspective, but I think the Greeks also maybe think a little too highly of themselves. Um, and so, I mean, I don't think they would include the Romans as like worth their time in terms of, um,
The upstart Romans.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like, so I think they would feel similarly about them. They also are Barbaros. If you're Roman, you're Barbaros. If you're Persian, you're Barbaros. It doesn't really matter. Um, but in terms of, and I guess also in that regard, um, there is a sense, I guess, in which the Greeks would see, because the Persians aren't, and I know this isn't the Babylonians, but that's the at least the Eastern community at the time of Alexander the Great and Aristotle, etc. They're not self-ruled. They're ruled by a king, and they don't seem to have a freedom of human nature. So in that sense, I can see them as being Eastern. But what's fascinating about thinking about the Western tradition is that because the Western tradition just kind of grew and expanded over time, um, and that I think what's always I just recently read an essay with my fellow faculty member called "The Great Conversation," and it's basically like the preface to the Great Book series, and that was printed back by Britannica back in the 40s or 50s.
It's like
Yeah,
that
exactly.
one,
Yeah, that one. Exactly. It is that one. And I have great
the
tradition.
little thin one on the side. Yeah.
Yeah, great conversation might be other. Exactly. Thank you. I left my copy. Oh, I've got it over here. Anyway. But he talks a lot about, like, I think that language of the conversation brings in the idea of you've got these different strands of thought, so, and if you paint with a broad brush, you've got the kind of the Greek philosopher type, then you've got the Roman efficiency, we build empires and aqueducts and law, but then lo and behold, in because thanks to Providence, this upstart backwater group of Hebrews also becomes a which both geographically and in terms of the way they handle things from the Greco-Roman perspective are Eastern in one sense. Like they're kind of like very different. They do things differently. They think about their God very differently. It doesn't really work. And they're very particular about that and get kind of cantankerous if and so so I think in that sense, I mean, I don't know, I'm hesitant. Yes, I, I think there's a sense in which the Hebrew culture though has both been shaped by its own surroundings. Like Hebrew is both defining itself against, but has also been influenced by its time in Babylon, um, by its stories from Egypt, and so and in that regard, I do think there's antecedents in this, in that it do kind of don't just make it human, like you're alluding to, like are there themes that are similar to what we find in the epics of Homer or in the stories of the Bible, but also I think are I guess I'm not ready to kind of demonstrate like an antecedent to maybe some of the Greco-Roman stories, but certainly antecedent to some
Right.
of the Hebrew ways of thinking in terms of both language and the flood stories, and so if that's part of the Western story, then at least in that regard, it does have a Western, or at least is worth knowing, and in how it shapes
Right.
our understanding of Hebrew's tradition.
I think one aspect of like a classical work, and I have my own thoughts on what makes something a classic, and I always go back to fleets and how they're all moving in the same direction, and there's is a certain togetherness and kind of coordinated movement that it requires. But with the classical work, on another side of way of thinking about a classical work is that it sort of survived the the test of time, right? That it isn't as if kind of randomly the Epic of Gilgamesh survives over the centuries. That it, I mean, granted, there are physical kind of textual witnesses that have
Right,
survived, and I believe we have more than one copy.
right,
There's several fragments of this thing, and so just like you know. with the invention of the typewriter, everybody can kind of like write things, and you know, everybody had their MySpace page at some point in history. Maybe you're still holding on to your MySpace page, even if the company went down. Uh, and sort of a democratization of writing. But in the classical world, right, you maybe you had that, right, in the ancient Roman, poets would self-publish and put out their pamphlets and these kinds of things, usually saying awful things about their competitors, but those don't necessarily all survive, right? That it
Right.
requires, through the ages, a preservation of the text. And normally in the West, it required some probably some monk in the Middle Ages to consider this thing worthy enough to continue to recopy as the manuscripts, decay in the library or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, and so when we see something, we see these sort of thematic tales, these sort of vignettes or stories within the Epic of Gilgamesh kind of take place. They kind of we receive them, uh, historically in a kind of a fragmented way, but we receive them nonetheless as sort of the finished product of these are the stories that kind of resonate with that society to the point where they kind of come to the surface, right? That they can influence, the Israelites in captivity in Babylon, where they can influence, our own thought. Now we can see those resonances, right? We see, a flood narrative, and we're like, oh, okay, this is something historical, and yet something, uh, that it has always kind of pointed us towards something beyond just, there's a lot of rain and large portions of the world kind of flooded,
Right.
right? And so I think, uh, unlike kind of the difficulty of our own age, in which we are sort of flooded with media, which is funny because normally we could be flooded with ideas, but now we're flooded with just sort of this medium of exchange of words and
Yeah.
images that, have no kind of built-in filter, no cultural filter, and really, kind of the commercial market becomes that cultural filter, and I don't necessarily think that's the best way for a culture to survive or continue. And so kind of the point I'm trying to make is that in the ancient world there is, I don't want to say a novelty to the written word, but there is a a an intentionality to
Yeah.
recording tales that, is a striving to make them, not only good but perfect, or at least complete in what they're trying to convey, not just in the script, into the words, but into kind of the human condition that they're trying to get out and to pass on to the next generation. Any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah. I mean, um, the word that came to mind too is there's a scarcity of the written word that I think we, because once you know about the manuscript traditions, or when you live in the modern world where, well, we don't even have to print in the physical sense things anymore. Everything is written and it's on screens, etc. Yeah, there's a scarcity. It's hard to kind of appreciate, and so that I like the word you use in intentionality is if I'm going to write something down, it's got to be worth it. It's got to be meaningful, and so if it's going to be something artful, it's going to have um, it, it's gonna mean something. It may be I'm going to write something down because these are the official documents I need to write down for the king and keep track of how many pigs were brought in, and the tax records. But when I have, and I guess that's the other thing about this is kind of getting us maybe like, this kind of segues us to start thinking about the form. If I'm going to start writing something just for its own sake, like a poem or a story or something of that sort, um, yeah, I think that is fair to say that there needs to be a measure of intentionality that, well, there certainly seems to be a measure of intentionality that for some of the great works that have survived. Just to circle back, you made the comment about like a
sure,
classic, those things that have survived. I think that's fair, but at the same time, there's also it there's all the kind of the tragedy of thinking of all the things that should have survived or we know existed but didn't survive for whatever reason, or maybe have survived and just haven't been uncovered yet, like because that's every once in a while you hear about that a new fragment here or a new that this text which we think is the portion of this tragedy of Euripides was discovered in this library.
Yeah, no, and I mean my April Fool's video this year was on Cicero's Hortensius, and the online class I was going to offer of this text that we don't have existing. So
Right.
if any of you watched the video and enjoyed that one, had a good lighthearted chuckle, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Yeah. So I mean,
works.
it's what makes a classic is this weird space of things that, um, on the one hand, I guess what I would say is yes, the things that have survived to the test of time seem to be things that deserve to and therefore deserve to be called classics. But I am imagining there's plenty of other classics out there that, for one reason or another, whether it's libraries in Alexandria getting burnt or what have you, didn't get a chance to stand the test of time and should have. And so it's very kind of cool to see something like, now that feels like it's in that space, and it didn't stand the test of time in one sense because, I mean, on one level, we even not only did we lose the work, we lost the language whereby we could translate the work, and so it took a group of people to spend a lot of time decoding Sumerian to be like, oh, we actually can start reading this stuff.
Similar to organic leaves, which provide the energy to grow delicious pears, BetterPears Leaves allows monthly supporters of $12 or more to support the ongoing work of BetterPears and also opt to receive a monthly goldback in the mail as our gift to you. Goldbacks are 24-karat gold leaf encased in polymer, which are privately minted and acceptable as species-legal tender instruments or instruments of barter, depending on the state. Please visit betterpears.com/leaves to learn more and become a monthly contributor today.
To your second question, you asked what makes an epic.
Right, the epic.
Yeah. Strictly speaking, if we're Greeks, it does have a particular form. You've got to have that martial, galloping, dactylic hexameter, and if you don't have that, get out of here. Um, I mean, I am more inclined to think, kind of have a, I mean, maybe it's having, well, because we've had different epics throughout the generations that try to fit into this world without necessarily embracing all the strictness of the form, all the way up into Paradise Lost, and even, you James Joyce playing with the idea of what's an epic with Ulysses, in novel
Right.
form. But I'm inclined to think, at least in the kind of traditional sense, the heart of what makes an epic is at least what you're going to focus on, which is the hero, and like people of heroic quality, people who are larger than life, people who are semi-divine even, um, and then go do things that the ordinary mortal, you know, dr- I wouldn't even say dreams of. Like, they don't want to dream of. Like, I don't want to go face the monsters in the woods. Like, no, 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 no. That's for the hero to do that. So, I mean, I think that's a kind of a quality of what the epic story is about. And it's fair to say, like, in common parlance, we call this the Epic of Gilgamesh. Is that the best word for it? Should be called the Tale of Gilgamesh. Is this more like the Hercules type stories and myths? Um, but there is something about it in that you've got a character who is, I was trying to find the exact line. Um, he's two-thirds made, the gods made him two-thirds god and one-third man, and he's the king of Uruk. And so you've already, like, right from the beginning, we're introduced to a person who he's not like other men, and so then what he does is going to be big and going to be powerful, and it's going to create controversy right from the beginning. And even so much that the gods are going to have to be like, all right, we got to put this guy in check. And so you see a lot of those themes that play out in the Iliad story with Diomedes and Achilles. And so all of that aspect is I guess in that regard, it has that epic feel there between the type of person that it's about. And I guess then the other say I think I would add to that is, at least in the Greek sense, you have your epics, which are about heroes, and tragedies also get to be about heroes, but the hero there, um, confronts his fatal flaw, and he doesn't often, or she doesn't often, make it out well from there. Like, they've discovered something about themselves, and or a dark secret in the past, what have you, and it ruins their life. It perhaps even kills them. Whereas in the epic, um, they get to go, the hero gets to go on that journey, but often comes back better from it. And like whether it's Achilles, like at the end, learning like to show mercy to Priam, or Odysseus reuniting with his wife, and then in Gilgamesh, I mean, it, what's interesting is this, at least the edition I have, has a prologue at the beginning, and it says, he went on a long journey, he was worn out, returning he rested, he engraved on the stone the whole story. Back up a line. He was wise, he saw mysteries and knew secret things, and brought us a tale of the days before the flood. So like what's interesting is, as a character, we get introduced to him first, of like he's this great strong man, and his first actions is just like effectively tyrannizing his city that he's king over. But then why he's remembered at the end is because he learned some wisdom, and he learned a little bit about mortality, and how do you face that? What's the proper way to face that? And that's what he brings back. Like that's what the people of Uruk are like. That's what we want to have inscribed. Which yeah.
Right. No, and I think kind of comparing it to say the two epics we have of Homer. I've already shared with you a number of my theories about Homer. One of them is this idea that in both there's a certain sort of piety and change of heart that occurs. Change of heart in the epic hero when confronted with an old man crying.
Mm.
So you mentioned sort of in the case of Achilles, right, and Priam, and sort of weeping for the body of Hector, and you kind of cited sort of this reunion with Penelope. I always find that reception a little bit cold. It's a whole
Yeah.
they've got some issues. But then after he rejoins with Penelope, kills all the suitors, kills all the women that were consorting with the suitors. We often overlook that when he hanged all
Right.
the women. Right?
Yeah.
It's like that got wow. This high school play is going to be really weird when we get to that part. But then after all of that, he goes to his father, right, who's conveniently offsite,
Yeah.
and begins to do the paradigmatic Odysseus like lie about something about who he is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he can be able. Well, I'm not sure if he's holding on to a different form, kind of mystically by the goddess or whatever, or if he's been away for so long that no one knows who he is. But
Yeah.
he's
Apparently,
pretending to be somebody
the
else.
nurse.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the nurse recognizes him. I see the scar. I recognize you, but everyone else, like, who is this guy?
Who is this
Yeah.
guy here? But the father, his father Laertes, right, begins to cry and weep for his lost son Odysseus,
Yeah.
and then that's when Odysseus kind of cracks and stops lying
Right.
and kind of makes that change. And you point to Gilgamesh, right, in the sense of learning wisdom, right. And I believe, right, some that wisdom from Utnapishtim, which is the name I wanted to say this whole episode, uh, about life, about
Yeah.
death, about kind of what matters, and I wonder if there's something to that as well, right? Kind of recognizing, even the hero recognizing his part in the grander scheme of wisdom, of receiving that from those who are older than him, or in the spirit of BetterPears, right? His betters. Your thoughts on the epic
No,
hero kind of having to learn in that sense.
yeah, I think I think you've hit the nail on the head too. And I think what's interesting about this tale is I think it brings it all to the forefront in a way that, particularly when you're teaching it to high schoolers, like it's, by the time you get to those scenes, and the other thing, nice thing about the Gilgamesh story, it's a lot shorter. So like if you've always wanted to read an epic, and I'm going to give you the pass. You've always wanted to read an epic, but the Odyssey just like 24 books, and only 4 of them are like the adventure tales everybody knows, and then the Iliad is just too much killing. This is short. It's brief. You go enjoy it, but it brings these themes right out to the front. Of you've got the hero who I mean, starts off by just terrorizing his own people that he's supposed to be king over, shepherding and looking out for, and then because of that, the gods check him by creating like his counterpart, if you will, his who and in effect becomes his kind of Patroclus type figure, who he befriends after they wrestle and fight, and they realize, hey, we're basically equals. They become best friends, and then spoilers, Enkidu dies, and that like that moment is what launches him into despair. Like, wow, I've lost my best friend, and if he died and he's my equal, then I might die, and I don't want to die. And so he goes on the quest for immortality, and but doesn't come back with immortality. He comes back with a tale. He saw secret mysteries, and he comes back with this tale of the flood of um, and what's interesting is the tale of the flood is very different than the tale of Noah's flood. Um,
Right.
a
Tell us a little bit about that.
it has no, well, even though the story, the traditional flood story, the biblical flood story, is clearly a instruction. I mean, it teaches us about righteousness, and it teaches us about the the righteousness of God, and God is looking on His creation and what's happened, and there's one righteous man out there and his family, and so well, there's the well, I guess it's twofold. It teaches about righteousness, but it also teaches us about mercy. And I mean, on one level, from God's perspective, He looks at the world and it is just gone kaput. Nothing is worth saving. But then He finds that one person that is demonstrating righteousness, and He's like, okay, here, this is the one that I can show them the way to salvation and show them how they can be spared this. That is not the gods of Sumer. The gods of Sumer are cranky. They're bored of people. They feel like there's not a moral tell here per se. They're just like, I think one of the lines is like they're, at least in the translation I have, it's like they're just being too loud and noisy. And like, all right, let's get rid of the mortals. Um, but but then the other thing is, and this is like this, from if you're a polytheistic theologian, you don't have to wrestle with the theodicy, because he's like, oh well, we've got some mean gods over here, but then there's the nice god over here, Ea, who comes to Unapishtim and is like, hey, this is what's going to happen, but here's how I'll spare you and your family. Um, and there's not, I didn't get a chance to look back at that scene, but from my memory, I don't feel like there was something particularly unique about him, like where he was as signaled as like this guy was particularly righteous. Um, it was more of, I mean, kind of like what you find in the Greco-Roman world. Like this was, I mean, like Odysseus is Athena's favorite, and that's why she frequently is coming to his aid. And I'm just trying to see if I can find the scene, but if I remember correctly, that's why it comes to him. It's like you're, um, you're basically my favorite. Um, yeah, he just says, yeah, the gods agreed to this and Lil to this, but Ea, because of his oath, warned me in a dream. There's just kind of this strong kinship between the god Ea and Unapishtim, and then he gives him his warning of this is what you've got to do. This is how you can take care of things. This is how you'll build your boat, tear down your house, yada yada, and be spared the abyss. So it's on the one hand, it's a very different story because it's framed differently, in that this isn't God judging the world and then finding that one righteous. This is more of
Right.
the whims of the gods, and we
Yes.
mortals have to deal with. Okay.
Uh, but one thing I think in terms of kind of the contrast between a biblical account of the flood and here in the epic, uh, and this is, we talked about learning from your betters, and this is sometimes I learn from my students. One time I asked my a student, like, so why are they building this Tower of Babel, right? The
Mm-hmm.
story that comes immediately after the flood, and I was kind of going on this kind of vein of, to be like God, and like as it clearly says in the text, and this idea of kind of trying to ascend. But I don't know if this is sort of like my Machiavellian student or whatever. But he's like, well, they just didn't trust the promise of the rainbow, right? They didn't trust that he wouldn't destroy the ball with the flood, and so they're going to build a tower, like a permanent ark, like this tower to the heavens, so that floods, they'll be flood proof, or at least some of them, at least whoever can ascend to the tower.
That's really
But it's
interesting.
interesting, right? Because Babylon, or Babel here, is is Ur, and so from the Ur perspective, what is going on with with the tower?
I the last I'd heard was that image of the Tower of Babel as a permanent arc, which is a very fascinating idea.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, you just like we'll just go up higher and see if your water gets us now.
Well, yeah. So it's the tower is the permanent arc. The other kind of moral theological implication is that the flood narrative in Genesis kind of acts as a prohibition against genocide, right?
Mm.
Uh, in the stereotypical, like, oh, we're going to do genocide because we're going to kill all the bad people and only the good people will be left. And this is sort of, the God of Israel saying, yeah, I tried that and it didn't work. Right? Like, no sooner did the eight survive that Noah's kind of a dry drunk for 3 years or so for this vineyard, and then immediately gets wasted. And so it's it's a reminder: don't try this at home, kids. Like genocide isn't going to work insofar as this problem of sin is a human problem, and something that's going to need a better remedy than just simply pruning.
Yeah,
However perfect that pruning might be, it's going to have a problem. It's something in our nature that even the righteous one can't um, heal for himself.
yeah,
But thank you again. I want to give some time to allow you to
okay.
kind of talk about your current projects and let our listeners, our audience, know how they can follow your work.
Yeah. So, I mean, the two big things that I have going on is my wife and I have written two books, children's books. One of them is called Faithful Friends. It's a story, it's a collection of 42 different biblical characters. I've done the writing. My wife did, Marcy Kelleher, she did the illustrating by way of her lovely cloth dolls that she makes. And we did a similar book a couple years ago called Sleepy Time Saints, a collection of 26 saints um, that are alphabetized. And so it's both an alphabet book and then with the writing of that, I tried the stories or the accounts are in poetic form, and I almost tried to write them like a nursery rhyme, so like a child can memorize them and have something like that you could hold on to for long term. Um, and this is less about my work, but part of that work is a lot of what Marcy's doing with her doll work, in that she's used it for the illustrating. We're hoping to produce some more children's books together, but she's always still producing dolls both on her own and has been working with women in Nepal to um, be able to make more dolls and support trades overseas so that these women can have a good livelihood. um, I recently started a Medium account, trying to do some writing just to share thoughts and stories. Haven't added a lot to it, but I'll try to add more. If I've got a potential audience out there, and it's something I like to do. I really enjoy the writing. I write for our school, and I write about whatever I'm thinking about. And so sometimes it's solar eclipse stories. Sometimes it's gonna be classical education, and sometimes it might be obscure philosophy. So we'll see. But that's me.
Excellent, Michael. Yeah, no, it's uh, so what is one thing you kind of picked up from writing children's books? In the sense, I always have like a threshold of how young an audience I can have, otherwise it turns into like kindergarten cop and just who is your daddy and what does he do. So what was kind of an unexpected or interesting aspect of writing a children's book
Um,
that is kind of a different from your normal kind of flex in terms of uh,
yeah,
team
no, that's.
curriculum kind of
I
activities?
I think it taught me two things. Well, so these weren't the first children's books I had written. I'd also written a book about, it's like a historical fiction about, it's kind of a weird story, but the bringing of the smallpox vaccine across the ocean when there was a smallpox epidemic in New Spain. And so, in order to do that in the years before refrigeration, you need people to basically be inoculated, and then you basically have a chain of people passing the inoculation along. And as it happened, in order to do this, the king got a bunch of orphans from Spain to do it. And it's like, well, that would be a fun story to tell from a children's perspective. Um, and you're right. Like to go from living in the world of either, trying to work in the college grad school level of like Greek and Latin, then in teaching high schoolers to then, all right, how can I tell this story in such a way that like a child, hopefully 10, 11, 12 can pick it up and read and enjoy. Um, that took some kind of rethinking, reworking. Fortunately, I worked with our agent slash editor. She really helped me kind of find that voice a little bit. And in doing the Bible story project, I realized both like you can say a lot in 250 to 350 words, but you've got to learn concision. And so that was a really good practice for me to just be able to write quickly, write a story. I think the thing I wanted to do in writing the Bible stories is I didn't just want it to be like a bio of like, this was this person, here's some of the facts, but I wanted to kind of identify what's like the heart of their story, and how can I like what's their main character trait or something like that I can bring to the fore. Like I think one of my favorites was writing the centurion story, and in the story of the centurion, um, I wanted to avoid ever using the name Jesus until the very end, because if you're a Roman, you didn't know who this guy was. You're just going about your day, doing your business, and what you discover at the end. So that things like that. It was a really valuable process for me for my writing style. It taught me to write more efficiently.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Michael, for being our guest today. For our audience, for all of us at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire, thank you for watching. See you next time on the Confederal Reserve. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can click here to watch a recent interview of the Confederal Reserve, or over here to view the playlist of the BetterPears podcast.